She was burying her twins in the desert when a widowed Apache appeared. The morning sun rose mercilessly over the arid lands of rural Mexico in 1850, as if to punish even more those who already carried too much pain in their souls. Marisol, barely 17 years old, felt that every ray of light that touched her face was a divine sentence. Her trembling hands clutched the small bundles wrapped in worn rags, while tears fell silently onto the tattered cloth covering her newborn twins. The night before had been hell. The screams of pain that tore through her throat during childbirth were lost between the adobe walls of the small family home, with no one coming to her aid. Her mother, Maria, had stayed in the kitchen with reddened eyes, but without daring to challenge her husband's authority. Don Esteban, the patriarch of the family, had declared from the first day he learned of the pregnancy that this child was a curse, the fruit of the dishonor his youngest daughter had brought upon the family. Marisol remembered with painful clarity the moment she had confessed her condition to her parents. She was barely 16 when Tomas, the son of the village blacksmith, had begun to court her with sweet words and promises of a future together. He was a 20-year-old boy with no land, no money, but with a smile that made Marisol's heart race like a wild horse. During the months of their secret romance, they would meet behind the village church, where he would whisper in her ear that he loved her more than life itself and that he would soon ask Don Esteban for her hand in marriage. But when Marisol's belly began to grow and she could no longer hide it, Tomas disappeared one night like smoke from a dying campfire. The neighbors said he had gone north to look for work in the silver mines. Others whispered that he had fled when he found out he had gotten Don Esteban's daughter pregnant. The truth was that he had abandoned Marisol without an explanation, without a goodbye, without even the decency to face the consequences of his actions. The day Don Esteban found out, his face turned into a mask of fury and contempt that Marisol would never forget. "You are a disgrace to this family," he had shouted at her as his heavy hand rose threateningly. "A slut who let herself be fooled by a poor man with no future. You have stained the Herrera name forever." During the following months, Marisol lived like the ghost in her own home. Her father refused to speak to her, except to hurl insults and reproaches. Her mother brought her food in secret, but her eyes reflected a mixture of compassion and fear that hurt more than any blow. Marisol's older brothers, influenced by their father's attitude, treated her like a stranger, as if her presence contaminated the air they breathed. The whole town pointed at her when she dared to go out. The older women whispered as she passed, crossing themselves as if her mere presence was a bad omen. The men looked at her with a mixture of contempt and lust that made her feel naked and vulnerable. She had lost not only her love, but also her place in the world, her sense of belonging, her dignity as a woman. And now, after a night of indescribable pain, after bringing two little beings into the world who had barely had a chance to breathe, she found herself alone with her most devastating loss. The twins, two perfect but premature babies, had fought for their lives for less than 24 hours before their tiny hearts stopped beating forever. Her family's rejection had not ended with the pregnancy. Now, with the lifeless bodies of her children in her arms, Marisol understood that her punishment was just beginning. Don Esteban had declared that he would not allow those damned bastards to be buried in sacred ground, much less allow his disgraced daughter to remain under his roof for another day. If only the women watching this story right now knew what it meant to carry such pain. If any of you have felt the weight of rejection, if you have experienced that loneliness that hurts in your soul, let me know in the comments where you were joining us. Because this story is just beginning, and Marisol needs to feel that she is not completely alone on her journey. Dawn had come like a silent thief, stealing from Marisol the last hours she could hold her babies alive. When the first one stopped breathing, she thought her heart had stopped too. He was a perfect little boy with delicate features that reminded her so much of Tomas that it hurt to look at him. His little hands, no bigger than rose petals, had slowly grown cold as she rocked him, whispering words of love that she knew he could no longer hear. The second twin followed his brother just 2 hours later. He had Marisol's eyes, large and dark, which had opened briefly to look at her before closing forever. During those few minutes of life, he had managed to let out a faint cry that pierced his mother's soul like a thorn she would never be able to remove. Marisol wrapped them together in the only clean blanket she had managed to find, a cotton cloth that had belonged to her as a child. She held them against her chest for hours, breathing in the sweet scent that still emanated from their tiny bodies, memorizing every detail of their angelic faces. She knew that this would be the only chance she would ever have to be a mother, to feel the unconditional love she had dreamed of since she was a little girl. When the sun began to rise, Don Esteban appeared at the door of the room. His face showed not a hint of compassion or grief for the loss of his grandchildren. His eyes, hard as stone, rested on Marisol and the bundle she held, and his expression hardened even more. "Enough of this charade," he declared in a harsh voice. "I will not allow you to turn my house into a wake for that coward's bastards. Pack your things and leave. I don't want to see you here when I return from town." Maria, who had remained silent throughout her daughter's ordeal, finally found the courage to speak, though her voice trembled like a leaf in the wind. "Esteban, please, she's our daughter. She just lost her babies. You can't leave her like this. She has nowhere to go." "Shut up, woman," Don Esteban roared, turning to his wife with a look that could have melted metal. "This thing is no longer my daughter. From the moment she decided to behave like a slut, she ceased to belong to this family. And those monsters she gave birth to have no place under my roof, either alive or dead." Marisol felt something break inside her forever. It wasn't just her heart, which was already shattered into 1,000 pieces. It was her spirit, her faith in humanity, her last hope that perhaps, after all, her family could show even a moment of compassion in the midst of such tragedy. "Dad," she whispered, using the word she knew she no longer had the right to say. "Please, just let me bury them in the village cemetery. I'm not asking for anything else. Then I'll leave, and you'll never see me again." "The village cemetery?" Don Esteban let out a bitter, cruel laugh. "So everyone will know that the Herreras raised a prostitute who gave birth to bastards. Never. If you want to bury those cursed creatures, do it far away from here, in the desert where they belong, but don't stain the name of this family any further." He threw a half-empty canteen at her feet and turned his back on her.
"You have 1 hour to leave. If you're still here when I return, I'll have you whipped." Maria approached her daughter with tears in her eyes, but when she reached out to touch her, she pulled her hand back abruptly, as if afraid her husband would see her showing affection. Instead, she discreetly slipped a small package of dry tortillas and a little salted meat into Marisol's skirt. "Forgive me," she whispered, before leaving the room, leaving Marisol completely alone with her dead children and her infinite pain. It was then that Marisol understood that her family's rejection was absolute and final. There was no turning back, no forgiveness, no hope of reconciliation. She was a marked woman, an outcast who must bear her shame and grief alone. With slow, painful movements, she gathered her few belongings, the clothes she was wearing, the almost empty canteen, the food her mother had given her in secret, and most sacred of all, the little bodies of her twins wrapped in the cotton blanket. With each step, she moved further away from the only home she had ever known. It was like walking on broken glass, but she knew she had no choice. The desert awaited her with its burning, merciless arms, and she walked toward it, carrying in her arms the only thing that had truly belonged to her in this world, the pure and unconditional love she had felt for her children, even if it had only been for a few precious hours. The midday heat fell on Marisol like a divine curse as her bare feet sank into the burning sand of the Mexican desert. She had walked for hours, moving further and further away from everything she had ever known, carrying in her arms the most painful burden a mother could bear. Her children, motionless and silent, seemed to weigh more with every step she took, not because of their physical mass, but because of the desperate love and guilt that enveloped them. The landscape around her was an endless expanse of desolation that perfectly mirrored the state of her soul. Lonely cacti stood like silent sentinels, their spines reminding her that even plants had learned to protect themselves in this cruel world. The wind blew small swirls of dust that stung her eyes, already swollen from crying, and the relentless sun turned every drop of sweat into a reminder that her life was slowly slipping away. Her cracked, dry lips whispered prayers she had learned as a child, desperate pleas to a God who seemed to have turned his back on her. "Our Father who art in heaven," she began, but the words died in her parched throat. How could she ask God to forgive her when she didn't know what sin she was guilty of? Of loving? Of trusting? Of being a woman in a world that punished women for existing? Memories tormented her as she walked. She could see Tomas's face with painful clarity, his brown eyes shining when he looked at her, the way his mouth curved when he told her she was the most beautiful woman in the world, the promises he had made to her under the moonlight. "I'll make you my wife, Marisol," he had whispered one night as he held her in his arms. "We'll build a house together, raise strong and beautiful children, and grow old watching our grandchildren grow up." All lies, empty words spoken by a coward who heard junk at them when things got complicated. But more than Tomas's betrayal, what truly devastated her was the rejection of her own family. Her father, the man who had carried her on his shoulders when she was little, who had taught her to ride a horse, and who had once promised to protect her from all the evils of the world, now considered her less than nothing. Her mother, who had sung lullabies to help her sleep, who had kissed and bandaged her scraped knees, now didn't even dare to look her in the eye for fear of defying her husband. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, Marisol could no longer take another step. Her legs trembled like dry branches in the wind, and her canteen had been empty for hours. She sank to her knees in a small clearing, surrounded by reddish rocks that offered some shade. The place seemed appropriate for what she had to do, secluded, silent, forgotten by God and man, like herself. With infinite care, she laid her babies on the ground and began to finish the job with her bare hands. The earth was hard and dry, mixed with small stones that cut her skin, but she continued digging with desperate determination. Each handful of earth she pulled out was like tearing a piece of her own soul. Her nails broke, her fingers bled, but she did not stop. "Forgive me, my little angels," she murmured as she dug. "Forgive me for not being able to give you the life you deserved, for not being able to protect you, for bringing you into a world that didn't want you." Tears fell on the dry earth, creating small dark spots that evaporated almost instantly under the relentless heat. When she finally finished digging 2 small graves, Marisol sat down next to them and unwrapped her babies for the last time. She looked at them for a long time, memorizing every detail of their perfect faces, kissing their cold foreheads, whispering all the words of love she hadn't had the chance to say to them while they were alive. "Someday we'll meet again,"
she promised them, in a place where it doesn't matter if your parents were married, where it doesn't matter if your mother was poor, where all that matters is how much I love you. She kissed them one more time and wrapped them again in the cotton blanket, which would now be their eternal shroud. As she placed her babies in their little graves, Marisol felt something break inside her forever. It wasn't just the pain of loss, it was the terrible realization that she was completely alone in the world. She had no family, no home, no future. All she had was this endless moment of goodbye under a sky tinged with painful colors as the sun set. With trembling hands, she began to cover the little bodies with earth. Each handful she threw was like burying a part of herself. The silence of the desert was absolute, broken only by her sobs and the wind whispering among the rocks, as if it were the cry of all the broken hearts in the world. The last handful of earth fell onto the small grave with a dull sound that echoed in Marisol's heart like the final blow of a hammer on her soul. She remained there kneeling under the sky, which was beginning to turn purple, her hands bloody and her face streaked with tears that seemed to have no end. The silence of the desert was so deep that she could hear the desperate beating of her own heart, each painful reminder that she was still alive, while her babies lay motionless beneath the arid earth. She had placed 2 small stones as markers, not in the hope that someone else would come to visit them, but because she needed to believe that her children had a place in this world, even if it was this forgotten corner of the desert. Her lips moved in silent prayer, words that came more from her heart than from her memory. Take care of each other where you are now. Don't feel alone like your mother feels here. That was when she heard the noise. At first she thought it was the wind playing among the rocks, but then it became clearer. The rhythmic sound of hoofs against the hard earth made her tense, her heart beating even faster. In these desolate lands, a rider could mean many things, and few of them were good for a vulnerable woman alone.
She turned slowly, her hands still covered in dirt, and what she saw took her breath away. A man on a pinto horse was slowly approaching, his silhouette outlined against the fiery sunset sky. He wasn't Mexican, she knew that immediately. His skin had the copper tone of the eternal sun. His hair was black as night and hung down to his shoulders, and his face bore the noble lines of the native peoples of these lands. He was Apache. Marisol had heard terrible stories about the Apaches since she was a child, tales of ferocity and violence that mothers told to scare disobedient children. But this man, as he drew nearer, did not radiate menace. There was something in his posture, in the slow, respectful way he guided his horse, that told her he did not come with intentions to hurt. When he was close enough, Marisol could see that he was also carrying something in his arms, a small bundle wrapped in soft skins that moved slightly. It was a baby. The Apache's eyes, deep and dark as ancient wells, rested first on her, then on the small graves she had just finished, and finally returned to her face with an expression that moved her to the core. It was recognition. It was the recognition of a shared grief, of a loss that transcends words and languages, of a pain that only those who have experienced it firsthand can understand. The warrior dismounted his horse with fluid, silent movements, and Marisol could see that he too had been crying. His cheeks bore the wet marks of tears that had run silently, and in his eyes there was a depth of sadness that rivaled her own. Without saying a word, he approached the small graves and knelt beside them. Marisol held her breath, not knowing what to expect, but what he did surprised her completely. The Apache bowed his head in respect to the little dead ones, and then, in a deep, broken voice, began to sing in his native tongue. It was a song of mourning, a melody that spoke of loss and eternal love, even though Marisol did not understand the words.
When he finished singing, the man looked her straight in the eyes and in rudimentary but understandable Spanish said, "I also lost. My wife died 2 sons ago. Only he is left," he said, pointing to the baby he was carrying in his arms, a little boy who couldn't have been more than a few days old. Marisol felt her breath catch in her throat. Here, in the middle of the vast desert, she had found someone who understood her pain in a way that her own family never could or would. This stranger, this Apache, who, according to the stories, should be her enemy, showed more compassion and humanity than all the people she had ever known in her short life. "What's your name?" she asked in a trembling voice. "Noel," he replied, and the name sounded like the gentle wind among the pines, like water running over polished stones. "Go on, you who run like a jaguar." "I am Marisol," she replied, and for the first time in days, saying her own name did not cause her shame. Noel nodded solemnly, as if receiving a sacred gift. Then he extended his free hand toward her without touching her, but offering her the comfort of his presence. "You must not be alone with so much pain," he told her. "Pain is heavier when you carry it alone." Who would have thought that at this moment of absolute pain, an unexpected light would appear? If you have also experienced moments when you felt you couldn't go on, if you have known that darkness that seems eternal, I would like you to tell me in the comments what has helped you to keep going. Because sometimes, as happened to Marisol, hope comes from where we least expect it. The silence that followed the introductions was not uncomfortable, but filled with a deep understanding that transcended the barriers of language and culture. Marisol watched Anuel as he contemplated the small graves and could see her own pain reflected in his face. It was like looking into a mirror of suffering, where every line of sadness on her face was echoed in the expression of the Apache warrior. The baby in Anuel's arms began to cry, with that desperate cry of newborns seeking the warmth and nourishment of their mother. The sound pierced Marisol's heart like an arrow, reminding her of what she could never give her own children. Instinctively, she reached out her arms toward the child, and Anuel, after a moment's hesitation, entrusted him to her. When Marisol felt the warm, living weight of the baby against her chest, something awakened in her that she had believed lost forever. Her arms automatically remembered how to hold a small child, how to rock him gently, how to whisper soothing words to him. The baby's crying gradually subsided, and his little fists clung to the fabric of her dress as if he knew he had found safe arms. "What was your wife's name?" she asked softly, not wanting to break the magical moment when the child had finally found peace. Anuel's eyes filled with fresh tears when he heard the question. "Anna," he replied, and the way he said the name was like a caress in the wind. It meant eternal flower. She was like spring, which always returns until it no longer returns. They remained silent for minutes, each lost in their own memories. Marisol imagined Anna as a beautiful and strong woman, capable of winning the heart of a warrior like Anuel. She wondered if she had a difficult birth, if she had suffered like her, and if her last words were for her baby or for her husband. She wanted many children, Noel continued. His voice was barely a whisper that mingled with the desert wind. She said our house would be full of laughter and little feet running. Now there is only silence. Marisol felt the tears welling up again, but this time they were not only for her own lost babies, but also for Anna, for Noel, for all the dreams that death had blinded before their time. "I dreamed that too," she admitted. "I thought my children would grow up strong and happy, that I would have the chance to teach them everything my mother taught me. But I didn't even have time to know the color of their eyes when they were awake." Noel moved slowly until he was sitting next to her, close enough to share her body heat, but respecting her personal space. He took a small leather canteen from his belt and offered it to her. "Drink. The desert does not forgive those who do not respect its power. The water was warm, but it was pure and refreshing. Marisol hadn't realized how dehydrated she was until she felt the liquid running down her parched throat. She handed the canteen back to Noel, but he shook his head. "No, keep it. I know where to find more water." "Why are you being so kind to me?" Marisol asked, genuinely confused. All her life she had been taught that the Apaches were heartless savages, enemies of her people. But this man showed more humanity and generosity than anyone she had ever known in her short life. Noel looked at her long before answering. Because pain recognizes pain. Because when the heart is broken, it doesn't matter what color your skin is or what language you speak. Suffering is the same everywhere. He paused, looking at the small graves. "And Ayana taught me that kindness is the only thing that remains when everything else is gone." At that moment, as if he had understood the conversation, Annual's baby opened his eyes and looked directly at Marisol. They were dark, deep eyes like his father's, but they had an innocence and purity that moved her deeply.
Unable to help herself, Marisol smiled for the first time in days. It was a small, painful smile, but it was real. "Hello, little one," she whispered to the baby. "Your mommy was a very lucky woman to have you. And your daddy loves you so much, I can see it in his eyes." Nahuel watched the interaction between Marisol and his son with a mixture of gratitude and melancholy. "He needs a mother," he murmured, almost to himself. "I don't know how to be a father and a mother at the same time." "Babies need love," Marisol replied, gently rocking the child. "And you have a lot of love to give. I can see that." She looked up at Nahuel. "What's his name?" "He doesn't have a name yet," Nahuel admitted. "In my village, children are named after they survive their first few moons. But enough time has passed now." He looked at his son with infinite tenderness. "I think I'll name him Itzal, which means moonlight, because he was born on the darkest night, but he's the light I have left." As the sun disappeared completely behind the mountains and the first stars began to appear in the desert sky, Marisol realized that for the first time since she had lost her babies, she did not feel completely alone. She had found, in the most unexpected place, a soulmate in suffering, someone who understood the weight of lost love and the responsibility to go on living despite the pain. Night fell suddenly, as if someone had extinguished the fire in the sky. The scorching heat of the day turned into a cold that penetrated to the bone, and Marisol, her hands still trembling, felt fear creep across her skin. She had never been so far from home, never felt the loneliness of the desert so intensely. Itzel, the little boy in her arms, stirred restlessly, seeking warmth and comfort. His closed eyes and clenched fists were a vivid reminder of what she had just lost. She pressed the baby against her chest, feeling his fragility awaken a deep, almost forgotten instinct in her. But then she realized that Nahuel was not there. Her heart raced. The echo of her old fears returned with a vengeance. Men always left, always ran away when she needed them most. What if he had left her too? What if it had all been a cruel mirage, a momentary comfort that the desert was now snatching away from her? Her eyes, slowly adjusting to the darkness, searched desperately for him. Nothing. Just the dark immensity, the silhouettes of cacti against the starry sky, and the cold wind blowing between the stones. The baby cried, a sharp, broken cry that mingled with her own sobbing. Marisol felt panic consume her. "No, don't leave me like this," she murmured, as if speaking to all those who had abandoned her before, her father, her mother, Tomas, even God himself. And then the sound of soft footsteps on the sand broke the silence. Nahuel appeared from the darkness, carrying a bundle of dry branches and roots in his arms. His face was barely illuminated by the dim moonlight, and when she saw him, Marisol felt her breath return. He hadn't left her. He was there.
With calm movements, Nahuel bent down in front of her, placed the branches between some stones, and lit a small but steady fire. The dancing glow illuminated their faces, revealing the traces of recent tears on both of them. "The cold kills faster than hunger," he said in broken Spanish, as he blew gently to stoke the flames. The heat began to spread, and Marisol, still holding the baby, moved closer to the fire, as if seeking refuge in that circle of light. Nahuel took a piece of fur blanket out of his bag and spread it on the sand. Then he pointed at her and the child. "Rest, I'll keep watch." Marisol looked at him suspiciously at first. She had heard so many terrible stories about the Apaches that her mind still doubted, but his gestures were clear, respectful, without any hint of threat. He gently stroked Itzel's forehead and placed him on the blanket beside her, making sure he was well covered. Nahuel, meanwhile, prepared a mixture of dried herbs in a small bowl. With steady hands, he ground the roots against a stone until they turned to powder. The bitter aroma rose into the air. "This gives strength to the body, to the heart." Marisol accepted the bowl with suspicion. The liquid was dark and bitter, but when it touched her throat, she felt a strange warmth, as if each sip restored a piece of lost energy. The silence of the desert was so vast that each spark from the fire seemed like a heartbeat in the night. Marisol's eyes fixed on Nahuel's silhouette, sitting across from her. The fire illuminated his scars, those marks that spoke of ancient struggles, of pains that could not be told in words. "Why are you helping me?" she finally asked in a low voice, as if afraid of the answer. Nahuel looked at her for a long time before speaking. "Because I know what it hurts to lose, and because if I leave you alone, you will die." The words were simple, but there was more truth in them than in all the promises Tomas had whispered her months ago. The baby, as if understanding the calm that had descended, stopped crying and fell asleep between them. Marisol looked at him with infinite tenderness, a child that was not her own, but who awakened in her a flame she thought had been extinguished. Nahuel pointed at the little boy. "He needs a mother." Marisol lowered her gaze. The memory of her twins pierced her chest like a knife. "And I don't have any children anymore." There was a long silence. Only the crackling of the wood accompanied their breathing. Finally, Nahuel picked up a branch and began to draw in the sand. He drew 2 small circles joined by a line, then another larger circle surrounding them. "You, me, them, together." Marisol followed the drawing with her eyes. It was simple, crude, but it contained a profound message. They were not alone. Their losses could be joined together, and in that union, perhaps they could create something new. A tear rolled down Marisol's cheek, but this time it was not of despair, but of relief. For the first time since she had lost her babies, she did not feel completely alone. She had found in the most unexpected place a soulmate in suffering, someone who understood the weight of lost love and the responsibility to go on living despite the pain. And you who are listening to this story, tell me, have you ever felt that in the midst of darkness, someone appeared who held your heart when you needed it most? Leave your answer in the comments, because your voice also lights this fire we're sharing here. The night progressed slowly. Marisol lay down next to Itzel, lulled by the warmth of the fire and Nahuel's silent presence. Exhaustion overcame her, and as her eyes closed, the last image she saw was that of the Apache warrior, watching over her in the darkness like a guardian of pain and perhaps something more. Dawn arrived with a golden glow that seemed incompatible with the pain that still burned in Marisol's heart. The sunlight painted the desert with shades of fire and copper, and yet for her, everything remained gray. She slowly sat up, her body aching, feeling the still warm skin blanket around her. Nahuel was standing by some rocks with the child in his arms. He rocked him with slow, almost ritualistic motions, as if with each sway he was offering a silent prayer to the sky. The image moved him deeply. A man hardened by life, marked by scars and losses, who still found in that little being a reason to keep breathing. Marisol stood up unsteadily. Her bare feet sank into the cold morning sand, reminding her of the wounds she had accumulated along the way. She walked over to the dying fire and sat down, hugging her knees. The memory of her father came back to her with a vengeance. Don Esteban's voice still echoed in her mind. "You are a disgrace. This thing is no longer my daughter." Those words had been more lethal than any whip. They had stripped her of her belonging, her identity, even the right to call herself a daughter. She couldn't help but speak, though her voice was barely a whisper. "My father threw me out of the house. He said I had disgraced his name, that my children were cursed." Noel looked at her silently. He didn't need to ask. His expression reflected understanding. Marisol lowered her head, feeling the shame return with a vengeance. "And Tomas, the father of my children." Her lips trembled as she uttered that name. "He swore he loved me, that we would be a family, that we would grow old together. But when he learned the truth, he disappeared. He left me alone, like everyone else." The wind blew, carrying with it a fine dust that mixed with the tears Marisol was trying to hold back. "The whole town looked at me as if I were less than nothing, a woman stained, and I was only 16 years old." Her voice broke into a sob and she covered her face with her hands. Noel, still carrying Itzel, walked over to her, knelt silently beside her, and without touching her, let the weight of his presence speak for him. After a moment, he said in a grave, measured voice, "I lost two. My wife died in childbirth. My brothers died in battle. Ayana was all I had, and she's gone." Marisol looked at him. In his dark eyes there was a sadness that seemed endless, but there was also something else. Respect. He didn't judge her. He didn't despise her. He saw her. "The pain," Noel continued, pointing first to his chest and then to hers, "lives here. It's heavy, but when it's shared, it's lighter." Marisol felt those words sink into her wounded heart like a balm. For the first time, someone wasn't telling her she should be ashamed. For the first time, someone recognized that her pain was real, that it wasn't divine punishment or a stain, but a deep wound that deserved to be healed. She stared at Itzel, who was sleeping peacefully in Noel's arms. The child breathed softly, oblivious to the tragedy that had marked his birth. And in that image, Marisol saw a reflection of what she had lost, and at the same time, a spark of what she could still have. "How do you keep going after everything you've lost?" she asked. Noel took a moment to respond. He looked up at the horizon where the sun was rising like a renewed flame. "Because if I let myself fall, he dies, and if he dies, then my heart dies too." Marisol understood. It wasn't about strength or pride or courage. It was about love. That same love she had felt for her twins during the few hours she had held them in her arms. That love that had kept her breathing even when she wanted to give up, she thought silently. Her father had branded her a disgraced woman, someone who had failed at everything. Tomas had abandoned her because she was too poor to bear the responsibility. But this man, a widowed Apache, a stranger, was teaching her, by his very presence, that life could go on, that something new could spring from pain. The wind blew hard, stirring up sand around them. Marisol closed her eyes and took a deep breath. For the first time since she had left home, she felt that perhaps the desert was not only death, perhaps it was also a place of rebirth. And as she opened her eyes and met Noel's gaze, she knew that their story was just beginning. The sun was already high in the sky when Noel placed the baby on a clean cloth spread out on the sand. The child, with round cheeks and copper-colored skin, waved his arms as if trying to cling to life with all his strength. Marisol looked at him with a mixture of tenderness and pain. In her gut, she still felt the emptiness of having lost her twins, an emptiness that nothing could fill. And yet when she saw that fragile baby, something in her chest trembled, as if an invisible thread connected her to him. Nawel spoke to her in a serious voice, pointing to the child. "Itzel," he said slowly, pronouncing the name with reverence. "It means moonlight." Marisol repeated the name in a whisper, caressing each syllable with her voice. "Itzel." The little boy stirred, and a soft cry escaped his lips. Nawel, with a confident gesture, took the water canteen and soaked a piece of cloth to refresh his lips, but then looked at Marisol with some hesitation. "Do you want to hold him?" She felt her heart stop for a moment. Her hands trembled, and the memory of her twins' lifeless bodies hit her like a cruel wave. But something in Nawel's eyes gave her confidence. Slowly, she stretched out her arms, and the Apache placed Itzel in her lap. The baby snuggled against her chest, seeking warmth. Marisol felt her breathing slow, as if he recognized her as a refuge. Tears began to roll down her cheeks, silent and unstoppable. "He's so small," she murmured, gently caressing his little head. "Like my children." Nawel sat down in front of her, watching without interrupting. There was a mixture of sadness and relief on his face, as if seeing Marisol with her son allowed him to finally let go of some of the weight he had been carrying. "It needs someone," Nawel said softly, "and you need someone too." Marisol looked up, surprised by the simplicity of those words. There was no demand, no judgment, no conditions, just a shared truth. The hours passed calmly. The wind carried the dry scent of the desert, but around that small group there was an invisible circle of tenderness and protection. Marisol began to sing a lullaby she remembered from her childhood, a song her mother used to sing secretly when her father was not there. The melody was soft, almost a whisper, and little by little Itzel fell asleep in her arms. The silence was filled with meaning. Nawel, seeing them together, thought of Ayana, his wife. He remembered how she had held the child for just a few seconds before fading away forever. It hurt, but it was also a relief to see that his son could still receive a mother's love, even if it came from another woman. When the sun began to set, Nawel offered Marisol some roots and dried meat. She ate slowly, without taking the baby from her lap. She felt needed for the first time in a long time. She was no longer the rejected and abandoned young woman. At that moment, she was someone who could give life, warmth, and care. Before going to sleep, Nawel approached her and said a short phrase in his Apache language. Marisol didn't understand, but his tone was enough to convey trust. Then he translated in Spanish with a rough accent, "Thank you for taking care of him as if it were your own." She didn't know how to respond. She just smiled weakly and caressed Itzel's sleeping face once more. In her heart, a seed of hope had begun to sprout. That night, as the stars covered the sky and the desert breathed in its immensity, Marisol closed her eyes with the baby in her arms, and in that moment, she understood something that shook her to the core. Perhaps life had taken 2 children from her, but it was also offering her the opportunity to be a mother again, in an unexpected way.
The fire crackled softly, and Nawel, sitting nearby, watched them in silence. The wind carried with it an ancient murmur, as if the spirits of the desert were whispering that from the union of pain they could make something new, something sacred. Marisol fell asleep, and in her dream the twins appeared, smiling. There was no sadness on their faces, only peace, as if they were telling her that it was okay to move on. When she awoke at dawn, Itzel was still alive in her arms, breathing calmly, and Marisol, her heart pounding, knew that destiny still had more paths to follow alongside that Apache warrior. Dawn bathed the horizon in golden hues when Nawel took the reins of his horse and, in a firm voice, invited Marisol to follow him. She carried little Itzel, wrapped in a makeshift blanket she had woven from the scraps of fabric he had given her. The baby slept peacefully as the desert wind kicked up clouds of dust around them. "I want to show you something," Nauel said, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Marisol hesitated for a moment, but agreed. She had learned in those days of silence and shared tenderness that every gesture of the Apache had a deep meaning. He was not a man of empty words. They made their way along a path hidden among red rocks that rose like silent guardians. The sun beat down hard, but as they entered a kind of narrow canyon, the air became cooler. The echo of their footsteps seemed to resonate with a special solemnity, as if they were crossing a threshold into a sacred place. Finally, they came to a hidden valley, surrounded by low mountains and carpeted with dry grass that still sparkled green between the cracks in the earth. There, under a solitary tree with twisted branches, was a simple grave marked with carefully aligned stones. Nauel dismounted from his horse and knelt in front of the mound. His breathing became heavy, and his hands trembled as he touched the earth. "Here lies Aana," he whispered, his voice breaking. Marisol pressed little Itzel against her chest. The silence between them was heavy with respect. Nauel took a handful of earth and let it fall slowly onto the grave, as if each grain contained a piece of his heart. "She gave me my son," he continued, tears welling up in his dark eyes, "and she paid with her life." Marisol approached slowly, her steps uncertain. She looked at the grave and felt a shiver run through her. She remembered the two little cobras in the desert, the dust-covered bodies of her twins, and felt that the same wound united them. "I buried my children too," she whispered, her voice breaking. She knelt down beside Nauel, and for the first time the tears flowed freely. Nauel did not interrupt her, did not try to comfort her with empty words, but simply remained there sharing her pain, letting the silence speak for them. The Apache picked up a stick from the ground and began to trace symbols in the earth around the grave. They were simple figures, circles joined together, lines crossing like intertwined paths. "This means that our losses are here," he explained in a grave voice. "Pain is not divided, it is shared." Marisol ran her fingers over the lines and felt as if that earth, laden with tears and memories, also received hers. The valley seemed to hold a sacred echo, as if the spirits of those who had departed were listening to them and accompanying them. The baby awoke and began to cry. Marisol cradled him against her chest, and suddenly that cry became a sound of life in the midst of death. Nauel looked at him and then placed his hand on Marisol's shoulder. "He's the reason we're still here," he said in a whisper. "Our dead will not return, but their blood lives on in us." Marisol looked at him intently, her eyes filled with tears, and nodded. In that moment, she understood that this valley was not a place of death, but of rebirth, a space where their grief had come together and intertwined, opening up the possibility of a new beginning. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky purple and orange. Marisol, with Itzel asleep in her arms again, allowed herself to smile for the first time since she had lost her children. It was a fragile smile, born of tears, but it was genuine. Nauel, seeing her, bowed his head respectfully. He knew something had changed. They were no longer two strangers united by chance in the desert. Now they were two souls marked by pain, who had decided not to walk alone anymore. That night, in the Valley of Mourning, the wind blew softly, as if caressing their wearied hearts. And although the scars would remain, a seed of hope had been planted. The following days were different. Something in Marisol had changed since that afternoon in the valley when her tears mixed with Nauel's. It wasn't that the pain had disappeared, because the absence of her twins was still alive in every corner of her body. But now there was a new strength, an inner voice telling her that she was not doomed to die alone. Nauel could sense it in her gestures. Before, the young woman walked with her eyes fixed on the ground, as if the burning sand were her only destination. But now, although still shy, she sometimes raised her face and stopped to look at the immense sky, as if searching there for a sign that there was still life for her. One afternoon, as the sun was setting behind the hills, Nawel took her to a stream hidden among the rocks. The water was crystal clear and cool, a rare gift in the middle of the desert. "I used to come here with my wife when the heat was unbearable," he said quietly. "Now I want you to see it too." Marisol leaned over the stream and dipped her hands into the water. The coolness washed over her immediately, as if cleansing not only her skin, but something deeper. She drank and for the first time in many days felt that the liquid not only quenched her thirst, but also brought life back to her soul. Little Itzel played with her fingers, laughing when the water splashed him. Marisol picked him up and lifted him towards the sky, and as she listened to his laughter, she felt a shiver run through her. He was not her biological son, but the bond growing between them was impossible to deny. That night, around the campfire, Marisol watched Nawel sharpen his knife while singing in his ancestral language. She did not understand the words, but the tone conveyed something profound, like a prayer or a promise. She approached him with the baby sleeping in her lap. "What are you saying when you sing like that?" she asked curiously. Nawel looked at her for a moment before answering. "I'm talking to my ancestors, asking them for strength and thanking them for bringing me here with you." Marisol looked down, moved. No one had ever spoken to her with such sincerity. Her father had only condemned her with insults, and the poor boy who had left her had never dared to look at her with respect. Nawel, on the other hand, seemed to see her more than just a burden. As the days passed, their coexistence became a learning experience. Marisol began to understand some Apache words. He taught her to recognize medicinal roots, to light a fire with stones, to read the movement of the stars to find her way. Silently, she absorbed every gesture and treasured it as if it were seeds planted in fertile soil. One afternoon, as he patiently braided Marisol's hair, Nawel said, "Your hands are strong. Although they trembled when I saw you, now they hold life firmly." She blushed and lowered her gaze. "I don't think I'm strong. I've lost too much." Nawel shook his head gently. "Pain doesn't make you weak. It makes you more real." Marisol closed her eyes, letting those words sink in like a balm. She had experienced so much rejection that hearing this seemed like a miracle, and inside her, the idea began to germinate that perhaps she could still be a mother, a beloved woman. That night, as the wind blew softly over the bonfire, Marisol watched him with the sleeping child in her arms. The fire lit up his warrior's face, and at the same time showed the tenderness with which he caressed his son's forehead. It was then that she understood. This man had not only given her water and shelter, he was giving her back her hope. And even though the world was hostile, even though the shadow of her family and the village still weighed heavily on her memory, Marisol felt for the first time since she had left for the desert that she could dream of a future. It was just a spark, but in the darkness of her heart, that spark became a flame. The rumor spread as fast as the desert wind. At Marisol's parents' ranch, they said that the young woman had not died, as everyone thought, but had been kidnapped by an Apache. The neighbors repeated the story with voices full of contempt, painting her as a disgrace who was now mixing with the savages. No one dared to defend her. In those days, being a woman and vulnerable was enough for your voice to be drowned out by the echo of silence. Marisol knew nothing of these comments. In her new refuge with Nawel, every dawn felt like a gift. But while she learned to grind roots and sing little songs to the child, Mexican soldiers organized patrols in the village. They said it was necessary to rescue the lost girl. In reality, they were seeking to reaffirm their control over their lands and humiliate Apache, who, according to them, had dared to steal what did not belong to her. One morning, Nawel went out hunting, and when he returned, he noticed fresh footprints in the sand. They were heavy footsteps, too orderly to be those of ordinary travelers. The expression on his face changed immediately. He crouched down, touched the ground, and knew they were not alone. "There are men nearby," he said to Marisol in a low voice. "Soldiers." The young woman's heart stopped for a moment. The words "soldiers" and "father" mingled in her mind like a dark echo. The image of her father's stern face struck her hard. Had he been the one who asked for her to be found? Hadn't it been enough to expel her? Now he wanted to see her humiliated again? That night, while Itzel slept in a makeshift basket of dry fibers, Nahuel sat down in front of Marisol and spoke firmly. "Listen, if they come for you, you will not go back with them. I won't let them take away what you're starting to rebuild." Marisol looked at him with tears in her eyes. No one had ever said those words to her in her life. No one had ever said they would fight for her as if she were worth something. Her father had only cursed her. The man who had gotten her pregnant had abandoned her. But now this Apache warrior was promising to stay by her side, even in the face of armed men. The following days were filled with tension. Every sound of the wind raised suspicion. Nahuel patrolled the surroundings with his bow at the ready, while Marisol tried to stay calm and take care of the child. However, the threat became real one afternoon when they spotted a column of dust raised by horses in the distance. "They're coming this way," Nahuel whispered, clenching his jaw. Fear ran through Marisol's body. She didn't want to go back to that hell of screams and beatings where she was seen only as a burden. Her heart was beating so hard that she feared the soldiers could hear it even from a distance. When the men reached the edge of the valley, they began shouting insults in the direction of the shelter. One of their voices, loud and arrogant, rang out, "Give us back the girl! That place isn't for her. She belongs with her people." Marisol hid behind some rocks, trembling. Nahuel, however, stood tall in front of the shelter's entrance, with his bow drawn, and his gaze fixed on the intruders. It wasn't just an act of defense. It was a silent declaration that she was no longer alone, that her fate would not be decided by others. The air grew thick. The tension was palpable. Marisol, watching the scene, understood something profound. Her life was split in two. She could either return to those who despised her, or fight to stay with the man who had shared her pain like no one else. The soldiers retreated that day, promising to return, but the warning remained lodged like a dart in Marisol's heart. They could no longer live in hiding forever. That night, as the bonfire illuminated their tired faces, Nahuel took Marisol's hand. For the first time, she did not pull it away. "No matter how many come," he said in a low voice but firmly, "you will not be alone this time." Marisol looked at him with tears in her eyes. No one had ever said those words to her in her life. No one had ever said they would fight for her as if she were worth something. Her father had only cursed her. The man who had gotten her pregnant had abandoned her. But now this Apache warrior was promising to stay by her side, even in the face of armed men. The echo of the horse's hooves still reverberated in Marisol's memory. That afternoon when the soldiers had appeared, something inside her had broken, and at the same time, something new had begun to be born. She had lived her entire short life in fear of the judgment of others, first of her father, then of the poor man who had left her pregnant, and finally of the entire town that condemned her. But in Nahuel, she had discovered something else, the certainty that she was not alone. The nights in the desert had grown cold, and the fear that the soldiers would return kept her awake. The fire crackled softly, illuminating the stone walls. Nahuel, sitting across from her, sharpened his knife with slow movements, as if time itself had learned to stand still. The baby slept beside her, wrapped in skins. "I'm scared," Marisol said, suddenly breaking the silence.
If they find me, they'll take me away from here, and I don't want to go back." Her words hung in the air, fragile like glass about to shatter. Nahuel looked up. His dark eyes reflected the light of the fire, filled with a steady calm. "We are all afraid," he replied, "but fear does not decide our destiny. What we are capable of protecting does." Marisol looked at him with tears she could not hold back. No one had ever said those words to her before. She, accustomed to insults, contempt, and being labeled a burden, suddenly saw herself through the eyes of a man who did not judge her, who did not condemn her, but recognized her. Thunder broke the stillness of the desert. A storm was brewing, and rain began to beat down hard on the makeshift roof of branches and leather. The child woke up crying. Marisol took him in her arms and cradled him against her chest. Nahuel approached and covered them both with a thick blanket. At that moment, their hands touched. The contact was brief, but enough for Marisol to feel a different kind of warmth, a tremor that did not come from the cold or fear. She looked up and found him very close, so close that she could hear his breathing. "I don't understand why you're doing all this for me," she said in a broken voice. Nahuel bowed his head. "Because I saw your tears on the ground, and they were the same ones I shed on my wife's grave."
No one should have to bear so much pain alone. The confession fell on Marisol like healing rain. She understood that it wasn't pity he felt, but recognition. They had both lost. They had both buried pieces of themselves in the sand. And from that shared wound, an unbreakable bond was born. The baby's crying stopped. Silence hung between them, accompanied only by the distant roar of the storm. Then, without thinking, Marisol rested her forehead on Nahuel's shoulder. He didn't pull away. He wrapped his arms gently around her, as if embracing something fragile that he feared breaking. Their lips met that night, not with passionate fervor, but with a tenderness that hurt. It was a brief, timid kiss, full of respect, but also of a latent love that had been brewing amid the pain. Marisol closed her eyes. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel unwanted, used, or condemned. She felt chosen. The storm continued to batter the desert, but inside the small shelter, something new had been born. A silent pact, a love that needed no words to be understood. The desert dawned with a heavy silence, interrupted only by the distant howling of a coyote. Marisol woke up hugging the blanket that still held Nahuel's warmth. Outside, the sky was tinged with shades of red and gold, as if the earth itself were celebrating a new beginning. Weeks had passed since that storm. Rumors persisted in the village, and some men were still looking for them. But amid that constant fear, Marisol had found refuge. Nahuel's arms, her young son's laughter, the tenderness she had never experienced before. One morning, while collecting water from a hidden stream, dizziness forced her to stop. She felt her knees give way and leaned against a rock. The world was spinning. Her heart was pounding in her chest. Nahuel, who was nearby, ran to her. "What's wrong?" he asked, holding her tightly. Marisol swallowed hard, brought her hand to her belly, and could barely utter the words that terrified and excited her at the same time. "I think I'm going to have a baby." There was a long silence. The sound of the water crashing against the rocks grew louder than ever. Nahuel's eyes half opened, first in surprise, then with something she hadn't expected. A soft smile, full of calm. "So you won't be the one bearing more children in the sand," he said, gently caressing her face. "This child will grow up in arms that await him, not in a world that despises him." Tears rolled down Marisol's face.
She feared that the pain of her dead twins would consume her again, but at the same time, something inside her heart rose. The difference was clear, no longer the loneliness of the desert, but the promise of a real family. The following days were filled with changes. Nawel taught her how to prepare herbal teas that strengthened the body of pregnant women. Marisol, for her part, cared for the son he already had as if he were her own. She rocked him, sang to him softly, and inside she felt herself slowly rebuilding. But the fear still lingered. At night, as she caressed her belly, she remembered her father's words calling her. She remembered the cold eyes of the man who had left her, and yet, every time Nawel placed a hand on her belly and closed his eyes as if in prayer, she understood that this new life was not a punishment, but a blessing. The desert witnessed this rebirth. Together they built a more solid shelter in a hidden valley where the water ran clear and cacti bloomed in spring. There, Marisol allowed herself to dream of a different future. One afternoon, as the sun set behind the mountains, Nawel took her hands and looked at her with a seriousness that made her skin tingle. Marisol, this child will not be yours or mine alone. It will be the love that united us in pain and lifted us from the sand. It will be the proof that nothing dies in vain. She lowered her gaze, unable to hold back the tears, and nodded. For the first time in her life, a man was talking to her about their child, not as a source of shame, but as a miracle. In the vastness of the desert, where she had once buried her hopes, Marisol now carried in her womb the promise of a new dawn. And although the road ahead was still full of dangers and shadows, there was now a certainty in their hearts. That child would be born surrounded by love, not rejection. The dawn sky painted in shades of pink when Marisol felt that the moment had come. Pain shot through her like lightning bolts that originated in her womb and ran throughout her body. Nawel held her firmly, giving her water and words in his language that she barely understood, but which resonated like a sacred song. The hidden valley where they had taken refuge seemed to be silent. Not a bird, not a breath of wind dared to interrupt that moment. Only the echo of Marisol's efforts and Nawel's anxious heartbeat could be heard. The little boy, in the arms of an elderly Apache woman who had come to help, watched innocently, as if he understood that something sacred was about to happen. Hours of struggle turned into eternity. Marisol gritted her teeth, remembering every insult her father had held at her, every tear she had shed on the desert sand, every lonely night she had believed she would never be worthy of love or of being a mother. But just when she felt she could go no longer, a cry pierced the air. The cry of a baby, loud and clear as a trumpet in the early morning. Nawel, his hands trembling, lifted the newborn into the light of the rising sun. His eyes filled with tears as he contemplated the life that now blossomed amid so many scars. "Daughter of the sun," he whispered if it was a girl. "Son of the river," he murmured if it was a boy. Marisol held him to her chest. She felt the warmth of that little life, his heart beating strongly. And for the first time since the tragedy of her twins, her soul rested. There was no curse, no shame, only the certainty that love had triumphed. The Apache bent down beside her and kissed her forehead. "No more graves in the sand, Marisol. Now the earth gives us life, not pain." She closed her eyes and let the tears flow, but this time they were not tears of sadness, but of relief and gratitude. The image of the small crosses in the desert remained in her memory, but now it did not weigh on her like an open wound. It had become the roots of the new tree they were planting together. The following days were filled with intimate celebration. The cries of the newborn mingled with the laughter of Nawel's son. Marisol, her breasts full of milk, nursed them both, as if the universe had given her back what it had taken from her. The Apache watched her with silent pride, knowing that the girl marked by shame had now become the heart of her home. The nights in the valley were no longer cold. Around the campfire, Marisol and Nahuel told stories. He in his ancestral language, her in her broken Spanish. And although they came from different worlds, love had united them at the exact point where pain was transformed into strength. Over time, they traveled together to other villages, always with caution, but no longer with fear. Where there once was looks of contempt, now there was respect.
She, the young woman who had once been cast out as a disgrace, walked with her head held high, with one child in her arms and another holding her hand. The desert was no longer a tomb, it was a cradle. And every morning as she watched her children sleep together, Marisol repeated silently, "My pain was not in vain. From the sand, my new life sprouted." And perhaps as you listened to this story, you also felt something stir inside you. What part of this journey touched your heart the most? I would love to read your thoughts in the comments. If you are watching from Mexico, Argentina, Colombia, or anywhere else in the world, leave me a greeting to let me know how far these stories reach. And if you know someone who needs hope, share this story with them. These words may restore their faith in love and life. I invite you to subscribe to the channel to continue accompanying us in more stories like this one. Your company is what makes it possible for us to continue telling stories that heal and embrace the soul. Thank you for staying until the end. I embrace you from afar with all my heart. See you in the next story.